can't be president without understanding how the media works.
Presidents have a love-hate relationship with journalists and vice versa.
Today, we've had a national tragedy. 2 airplanes have crashed into the World Trade Center.
Whatever the media does, it allows presidents to amplify or communicate their personalities.
Ask not what your country can do for you.
Read my lips.
All presidents gripe about the media.
Don't get the impression that you arouse my anger.
Are you better off than you were 4 years ago?
From Fireside Chats to Twitter, U.S. presidents have employed the latest media technology to deliver their message. Yet, there has always been an adversarial relationship between the media and the commander-in-chief. Vanderbilt professor Dr. Vanessa Beasley has studied the history of presidential rhetoric with a particular focus on the interaction of the president and mass media. She says the media is our only means of accountability.
The founders felt so strongly about that they baked it into the Constitution, even though their media system was very, very different from the one we currently live in. And frankly, the one that we've lived in all the 20th century would have been hard for them to imagine. But that tension that presidents know that they probably don't trust the media, but they have to use the media. And we as citizens know that we have to have the media or else there's no watchdog function out there.
The press has a symbiotic relationship with the president.
Professor Tyler Page taught political communication at Mississippi State University before recently moving to the University of Connecticut.
The press needs the president because they're able to get stories that they can use to sell newspapers or broadcasts or whatever they're doing, and the president needs the press in order to get their message out.
When you look at the 20th century, there is a direct correlation between the technology of the media and the types of communication preferred by various administrations. This according to Mississippi State University Associate Professor of History, Richard Dams.
So you look at the big changes that take place from printed media to radio to television to cable television to modern-day social media. I think we see that has led to significant changes in the ways in which administrations try to convey their message.
Presidents need the media to get their message out, but their goal involves trying to bypass the press to reach out directly to the people. This allows presidents to control their message. In the country's early years, most presidents, when they talked to voters, it was outdoors in front of a large crowd. Woodrow Wilson brought the media into the White House, but Franklin Roosevelt changed that with his Fireside Chats on radio.
We're losing no time in getting the government's vast work relief program underway.
Tyler Page says it was with FDR when the dynamics of that relationship changed. He said the symbiotic relationship really meant the press had the upper hand, but the balance of power shifted toward the president.
Franklin Delano Roosevelt got fed up, and so he realized he could go around the media and do his Fireside Chats, which were radio addresses where he could speak directly to the country.
FDR was the first modern media president. This according to a specialist in government studies, Tennessee State University professor Dr. Brian Russell.
The Fireside Chats, the use of the radio, made it so that FDR got into people's living rooms. He was talking to Americans one-on-one and communicating them. That was a tool that allowed FDR to go directly into the homes of people.
My most immediate concern is in carrying out the purposes of the great work program just enacted by the Congress.
FDR's Fireside Chats allowed citizens to have a more personal relationship with the president, says Belmont Professor of American Government, Dr. Nathan Griffin.
What people didn't necessarily expect, and Roosevelt sort of changed that, sort of created more trust in the presidency. Of course, part of that was because he wanted the president to be stronger, and he wanted to use more powers and had Congress willing to hand them over to him. So he also had a greater need to reach people, but he had greater ability through radio.
Later in FDR's presidency, after World War II broke out, more than 50 million people were listening to him on the radio. That changed the perception of Americans and their government, and as Russell notes, put the president at the center of our political system.
And when you read the Constitution, the first article is about Congress. Congress is designed to be the supreme branch of government. But in the 20th century, with the advent of the modern media, presidents start taking the center stage. And I think that the Fireside Chats is going to be a first step that's really changing our government, our presidency, our country, and the people's interactions with the executive branch.
When Roosevelt died, Russell says Harry Truman became the first president to broadcast the State of the Union speech.
Because we can see the evolution of the presidency here. Presidents didn't used to be the primary mover and shakers. You didn't expect presidents to be putting policy ideas out there as much. And then Truman starts broadcasting, so that was a big step.
Richard Dam says during Dwight Eisenhower's years in office from 1952 to 1960, the country witnessed tremendous growth in viewership during the early days of television.
Eisenhower worked very closely with public relations firms, and in the course of the 1950s, I think the percentage of American homes that had televisions went from something like 30% to 90%. So the real growth in the television ownership is actually in the 1950s.
Russell adds Dwight Eisenhower delivered the first televised Fireside Chats. He says Ike was also the first president to hire a media consultant. But most historians consider John F. Kennedy to be our first television president.
I, John Fitzgerald Kennedy.
In JFK's inaugural address, he delivered this memorable line.
And so, my fellow Americans, ask not what your country can do for you. Ask what you can do for your country.
In the first televised debate, John Kennedy versus Richard Nixon, Griffith notes how television changed perceptions of the candidates.
People who listened to the debate on the radio who couldn't see Nixon, his people didn't know to put makeup on him in front of a camera, so he looked awful. At JFK, his people knew to put makeup on him. He knew how to handle himself in front of a camera better. And that people who watched on TV thought JFK won, and people who listened to it on radio thought that Nixon won. It tends not to be, unfortunately, about who actually had the better positions. It tends to be more about how you felt about them. That's why media becomes such a big influencer, because it allows presidents to influence how people feel about them.
Former anchor and host of Face the Nation, Bob Schieffer, who has interviewed every president since Nixon and covered the aftermath of Kennedy's assassination, adds the one thing that had the most to do with shaping JFK's presidency was what got him elected: television.
In what would be a very close election, analysts said the TV debate tipped the election to Kennedy. Kennedy became the first president to allow live coverage of his news conferences, and he held on average one every 16 days.
Schieffer, on this CBS report, looked back at John Kennedy on what would have been JFK's 100th birthday.
You know, with the youth and the glamour and the excitement that the Kennedys brought to the White House, they turned the black and white movie of American politics into blazing Technicolor. And then, with his tragic death, John Kennedy became not just an icon, but an almost mythical figure. To many, the Kennedys became America's royal family.
With Kennedy, the relationship between television and the president became obvious, according to Vanessa Beasley.
Once that sort of genie was out of the bottle, there was no way to put that back in. You have to have a candidate who can work the media, for lack of a different phrase, who can be telegenic, who's comfortable speaking.
Kennedy's charisma and his appeal to the camera played a big part in his candidacy, his presidency, and his legacy.
From Dallas, Texas, the flash, apparently official, President Kennedy died at 1 p.m. Central Standard Time.
Vice President Lyndon Johnson took over after JFK's death. Many would laud Johnson's domestic policy and his fight for civil rights, but most remember LBJ for one thing.
The enemy struck across the length and breadth of South Vietnam.
When the American public saw the Vietnam War on television each night, many began to have a different view than policymakers. Some said it was Walter Cronkite's summation about the war in his CBS documentary that prompted LBJ to say if he has lost Cronkite, he has lost Middle America.
It is increasingly clear to this reporter that the only rational way out then will be to negotiate, not as victors, but as an honorable people who lived up to their pledge to defend democracy and did the best they could.
As Vanderbilt professor Vanessa Beasley notes, Johnson inherited a deeply grieved nation after Kennedy's assassination.
He came after this person who was really a rock star on television, right? Kennedy made it look easy. He was attractive. He was young, all the things the camera loves. And you could argue that the camera really didn't love the way LBJ looked, the way he spoke. He tried to figure out how he could make this work for him. He had a television station built into the White House. Literally the idea that I'm going to have this happen on my own terms and on my own ground.
Johnson did not run for re-election. TSU professor Brian Russell says presidents want to bypass the media and control the message.
And as we can see here with the coverage in Vietnam, LBJ didn't have control of the message anymore. Americans had the war on their TVs every night, coming into their houses. And one of the reasons the presidents like to control the message and reach directly to the people so they can control the narrative. Lyndon Johnson lost control of the narrative with everything appearing on TV.
Richard Nixon was elected twice, was praised for his foreign policy, but later resigned due to the Watergate scandal. Factor into this equation, Russell says Nixon had a poor relationship with the media.
But he did like to monitor the media. He wasn't watching and reading all the news, but his staff was paying attention to it and trying to figure out ways to manipulate the media. When you read about presidents in the media, they mention Nixon not being able to get along with the media and not being able to negotiate that relationship.
Nixon said in a 1973 news conference he had never seen such vicious reporting in 27 years of public life.
I'm not blaming anybody for that. Perhaps what happened is that what we did brought it about.
Nixon, in his words, said when people are pounded night after night with what he called hysterical reporting, it naturally shakes their confidence. But then he took a turn.
Don't get the impression that you arouse my anger. One can only be angry with those he respects.
We learned just how much Nixon distrusted the media in his tapes from the White House, according to Vanderbilt professor Vanessa Beasley.
Nixon really, really hated the media. I mean, it's interesting because the tapes give us the illusion of sort of the private presidency and what he really thought behind the scenes when he knew he wasn't on camera or being interviewed. And to the extent that the tapes show us how much he hated the press, it almost makes his presidency more interesting because you can see, in a sense, that he's being very restrained when he's talking to the press.
Yet Nixon was the first to poke fun at himself on the TV show Laugh-In.
Sock it to me?
But Russell says after Vietnam and Watergate, we reached a demarcation point between the media and the president that actually started with Kennedy and allegations of infidelity.
The media knew about those things. They didn't broadcast them. But if we go back and look at the media in the 60s, it's going to be a much more deferential treatment of the president. It's going to be a much more kind of a neutral recording of what's coming out of the White House. And today, there's less of that and a much more commentary. And that big switch is going to be happening at the end of Vietnam and Watergate.
Once Nixon resigned, Gerald Ford served a partial term in the 1970s, but as Russell adds, was known by many for how NBC's Saturday Night Live portrayed him.
When you talk about Gerald Ford in the media, the first thing that comes to my mind is how popular media made fun of him. And he was, in fact, maybe the best athletic president we've ever had. And popular media, shows like Saturday Night Live at the time period, pretty much shaped what people thought about the presidency.
Jimmy Carter told CBS correspondent Bill Plant he had a contentious relationship with the media in that after Watergate, reporters had, in his words, a highly focused reportorial attitude.
So I think in many ways I could have done a better job of, you might say, seducing the press. As a matter of fact, all the way through the book that I wrote, I describe how we brought the key leaders of all of the major networks and the 3 major newspapers into the White House to negotiate me at night and to ask me any question they wanted to. And I tried to heal wounds, but I never was able to do so.
Beasley says Carter was not as media savvy as someone you would have expected from that era.
And I think that we were in a time at that moment where some voters might have found that refreshing, but I don't think it's a coincidence that the president who comes after him is, again, someone who understands mass media very, very well.
Ronald Reagan had been an actor and enjoyed being in front of the media. When Reagan ran for office, defeating Carter's attempt for a second term, many questioned his age, which was 73 when he was elected. But Reagan was adept at using humor to get his message across.
Today marks my first State of the Union address to you, a constitutional duty as old as our republic itself. President Washington began this tradition in 1790. For our friends in the press who place a high premium on accuracy, let me say, I did not actually hear George Washington say that.
During a debate, Reagan also used his experience to his advantage.
I will not make age an issue of this campaign. I am not going to exploit, for political purposes, my opponent's youth and inexperience.
Reagan knew how to talk in memorable sound bites.
Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall.
But, as Russell notes, even Reagan had issues in his second term.
Reagan is a master of the media. I mean, he portrayed a presidential image. Of course, even by the end of his presidency, they're going to lose control of the narrative because we're going to have the Iran-Contra. But I think that President Reagan did use the media well.
Reagan's humor also got him into trouble, as we hear in this 1984 report from NBC's Marvin Kalb.
The president was joking his way through an audio check on August 11th.
That I've signed legislation that will outlaw Russia forever. We begin bombing in 5 minutes.
By August 14th, the story became world news, a major item on Moscow television where the joke was not treated as a laughing matter.
Many, including TSU professor Brian Russell, thought George H.W. Bush had a tough act to follow in Ronald Reagan.
And I don't think that he used the media as well. And, I mean, how do you follow Ronald Reagan? How do you follow the master on that?
I will keep America moving forward for a better America, for an endless, enduring dream and 1,000 points of light.
Bush was done in by one statement he made.
Read my lips. No new taxes.
And every president since Ford and Carter has had to endure comedy skits from Saturday Night Live, including this Dana Carvey Bush impersonation.
Not going to do it. Wouldn't be prudent.
When Bill Clinton ran for office, much like Kennedy and Reagan, he was a natural for the camera and was one of the first to use a late-night talk show appearance to his advantage. CNN's John King says Clinton's appearance on Arsenio Hall's show changed politics forever.
In the new television age of getting outside of the traditional news programs, taking a risk. A lot of people criticized him. A lot of people said this is not presidential. He won the election, so by definition, it worked.
Belmont professor Nathan Griffith says for his use of television, Clinton was unique.
Bill Clinton was the first president to ever be turned down when he asked for TV time because they said, "We're tired of it. You've asked for it so much. You've overused it."
But, as Russell notes, it was not all rosy for Clinton either.
Nixon had Watergate, Reagan had Iran-Contra, it's going to be the Whitewater scandals, the Lewinsky scandals, so I think Clinton had a very strong love-hate relationship with the media.
Russell says the media often played George W. Bush as not being smart enough when he defeated Clinton's vice president Al Gore.
And so the first year of his presidency, he was not a very strong president. He wasn't a very popular president. He didn't win the popular vote. But when September 11th happens, there's going to be a rally around the flag, and Bush was able to capitalize on those moments.
Today, we've had a national tragedy. 2 airplanes have crashed into the World Trade Center in an apparent terrorist attack on our country.
Russell adds, Bush showed strength in front of the media in declaring mission accomplished in taking down Saddam Hussein.
Bush is campaigning to try to get support for the Iraq War. There's a term by a political scientist named Samuel Cornell who talks about going public, about the popular presidency, and basically going over the heads of Congress and going out to the people to try to drum up support for their ideas. There's a lot of things about how they tried to use the media.
But Bush had what some called his Bushisms, gaffes on live media.
We got an issue in America. Too many good docs are getting out of business. Too many OBGYNs aren't able to practice their love with women all across this country.
I call upon all nations to do everything they can to stop these terrorist killers. Thank you. Now watch this drive.
Our enemies are innovative and resourceful, and so are we. They never stop thinking about new ways to harm our country and our people, and neither do we.
Barack Obama was the first to combine his charisma, TV savvy, and social media to attract voters.
We have to move forward to the future we imagined in 2008, where everyone gets a fair shot, and everyone does their fair share, and everyone plays by the same rules. That's the choice in this election.
Obama displayed his wit and humor in one debate with Republican candidate Mitt Romney.
Mr. President, have you looked at your pension?
No, I don't look at my pension. It's not as big as yours.
TSU professor Brian Russell discusses the impact of Obama's social media strategy.
What social media starts doing is it ultimately gives presidents what they've always been trying to do, and it's bypass reporters. And so presidents have a love-hate relationship with journalists and vice versa. Especially the Washington journalists, they got to have this relationship with the president. This is where they're getting all their information, and the president needs them because he's trying to get out what he's trying to do.
Russell says Donald Trump has taken bypassing the media to the next level through his use of Twitter.
This is him going directly to his base, and he can get the message out the way he wants it.
When it comes to a love-hate relationship, Russell says media is what made Trump president, due to his exposure on many media outlets and programs like The Apprentice.
Most Americans came to experience Trump as someone who was a decision maker, who got things done. So media is what made the personality that gave him the stepping stone to get into the presidency.
But it is Trump's allegations of fake news that many find problematic.
Not you, not you. Your organization's terrible.
Here's the president upon receiving a question from a CNN reporter at a press conference.
No, I'm not going to give you a question. I'm not going to give you a question. You are fake news.
Washington Post investigative journalist Bob Woodward says the reporting needs to get both facts and tone right.
The press, especially the so-called
mainstream media comes under regular attack, particularly during presidential campaigns like this one and its aftermath.
Woodward, speaking at the 2017 National Correspondents' Dinner, televised by CNN, adds, like politicians and presidents, sometimes the media make mistakes and go too far.
When that happens, we should own up to it. But the effort today to get this best obtainable version of the truth is largely made in good faith.
Clearly, having a verified, factual, and trustworthy source of information is critical to democracy.
Deb Wenger is a former assistant news director for a Tampa TV station. She says we have reached the point of an all-hands-on-deck time in journalism history.
Every news organization, every journalist, every member of the public needs to be thinking about how can I be sure that I'm informing myself with legitimate information.
Wenger, now a professor and interim dean at the University of Mississippi, says whether or not you think the president is right, or whether or not you believe there is fake news,
clearly there is misinformation being spread by individuals, sometimes inadvertently by news organizations, and we all have to do our part to stem that flow of false information.
Beasley says many have drawn comparisons of Nixon and Trump in their dealings with the media, but she notes one dissimilarity.
Part of Trump's brand, if you will, is just saying in public the things that Nixon probably would have said privately on those tapes about how much he hates the media. And I think Trump's team must have a sense that at least until this point, that's an efficacious strategy to go ahead and be open about how much they hate, particularly the mainstream media. The quotes where he talks about fake news, he focuses quite often on CNN, but there are several quotes where he talks about what you and I would consider the mainstream network-driven media.
Russell questions whether the political landscape has changed so much that only some type of grand media personality can compete for the presidency.
I don't think we're there yet. Trump used to have a reality show. Now he has a reality show on CNN, Fox News, and MSNBC because they're covering him 24/7. It seems like President Trump really only likes the kind of show aspects of the presidency. He likes to be on display much more than being in the back room trying to think out policy.
Mississippi State history professor Richard Dam says we have a current president exploiting a new technology via Twitter in a way that is unprecedented.
Almost every day we get a sense of where the president is coming from, and I'm just wondering how that might change in the next few years with a future administration and maybe further advances in technology. It seems that that direct line, that direct channel between the president and the American people is probably never going to be the same again.
Professor of Communication Tyler Page says the relationship between the president and the media is no longer mutually beneficial.
They don't see it as symbiotic, and because they don't, they are using social media, particularly Twitter, as a platform to go around the media and to put out statements unfiltered to the world. And you see media who are frustrated with this because they're reduced to reporting information that anybody could already get just by going to Twitter, and that's frustrating from a journalist perspective, and that's led to an even tenser relationship.
But Page says that relationship has to be tense, as it is somewhat adversarial when a primary function of journalists is to hold the powerful accountable.
Everyone sitting on press row has a job because the president or the president's staff will come out on press row and talk. And similarly, the president's biggest pulpit to get to the public, even today, is still through the press. What is most of the stuff people are reading on Twitter and Facebook? It's links to established traditional media sources.
Looking ahead, Griffith has one worry.
Part of the way President Trump uses social media to reach out is to rile people up. It's not to communicate with them in terms of getting them to think about things, but that does seem to be lately more of a trend, not just from President Trump, but from politicians of all stripes, is it's less and less about rational debate and more about we've got to beat the other side because they're evil, they're wrong, they're harmful.
Page says two things may happen. One, the bleak version. Partisan bashing will continue, media will offer more opinion-based reporting, and people only consume media they agree with. However, he has an upbeat view as well.
the hopeful is that you'll have a new group of centrist outlets that hopefully will be able to call balls and strikes and then allow opinion to stay opinion, that hopefully people will start to trend toward, well, just trying to understand objective facts. And it's okay to go to those opinion sites, but also to play from the same deck of facts.
Griffith says presidents have varied on how they use the media based on their personalities and what they think is important. He says, do not blame the media.
The media provides a tool and how we use it, whether it's as voters and citizens or whether it's as candidates. And how candidates use it says something about what we as citizens and voters let them do. It says things about us. It's like any tool. It's not itself to blame. It's just revealing of what we decide and the values that we hold.
CBS's Bob Schieffer says the best politicians were the masters of the dominant medium of their time.
The founders were great writers when most people got their news by the written word. Franklin Roosevelt was the first to recognize the power of radio. Kennedy was the absolute best at television. And there's no question President Trump used Twitter to great effect in the campaign. But here's the difference. I don't remember anyone telling Kennedy, you need to stop doing so much television. But everywhere I turn, I hear Trump supporters saying, if only he would stop those tweets.
Susan Milligan's article in the Columbia Journalism Review suggests the relationship between the media and the president is more distant than it has ever been. Reporters, working in what is arguably the freest press in the world, are finding it nearly impossible to accomplish their central mission, to explain why the president does what he does. This is Terry Likes reporting.